Hi, everybody. This is Greg Porter. I am a fellow congregant at Great Valley Presbyterian, and I am going to be teaching Cyber Sunday School the next 5 Sundays, and it's an honor to do so, and I hope you find this meaningful. I will also be glancing up at my computer screen as I go, just to make sure that I don't skip any points that I think are germane to our purposes, and I also probably will be stopping this at various times, so it may be a little jumpy. So I'm kind of a cyber novice, and that will soon become self-evident. Anyway, great to have you, and I hope again that this is something that's more than informational, but that it's actually formational for you and for all of us. We'll be looking at the life of one of the most amazing figures in the entire Bible, but in particular the Old Testament, and that is the life of Joseph. And also his family by extension. And he is, the thing I love about Joseph is that he finds himself in so many different scenes. And I am amazed at the transformation that takes place in his life, often without a lot of explanation. So we're kind of left to piece things together on our own and ask for God to guide us into all that is good and true and lovely as we ponder his life. And my theory is that spiritual formation takes place when the biblical story, the biblical narrative of one of the characters or the circumstance or the historical event intersects with our own story. And we can see what those who've gone before us, how they've responded well, and how they've maybe not responded all that well. So with that in mind, let's jump in a little bit. First of all, as you know, I'm a Presbyterian, and sure enough, truth be told, yes, we do get some things wrong. There's no doubt about that. We also get a few things right. One of those things is an understanding that salvation is both now and not yet. That is, salvation is both a finished work by Christ and an ongoing work by God in our daily lives. We call it we're reformed and always reforming. That is, we've been converted in general, and now that conversion is working its way into our daily habits so that what has happened in general becomes discernible in particular by the way that we treat others, by the way that we speak, by the way that we conduct our daily lives and habits. And I say that because the father of Joseph was a man named Jacob, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and he was given the name Israel by God, which means one who wrestles with God. In other words, Jacob was a workout for God, to say the least. And it was a name that was not given to Jacob on a whim. God didn't arrive at that name lightly. It was chosen carefully, allowing us a glimpse into what we should expect the life of faith to feel like. It's really a wrestling match between us and God. And no one was better at wrestling, I think, than Jacob. I mean, he trusted nobody. Jacob was essentially a manipulative conniver, always looking for an advantage and angles. He would see people really as resources from which he could extract certain advantages. He was always seemingly assessing and acquiring and accumulating. He's a very calculated man. He was arranging anything so that it would benefit him. And Jacob would deceive and maneuver and arrange his way through life, seeing even God, really, as simply another resource to be used for Jacob's own advantage. Not, of course, that we would ever do that. Jacob's comment to God, his comment to God in Genesis 32, I find is fascinating, and in many ways it's symptomatic of his life. I will not let you go unless you bless me. God is, and I know that he's been lauded for that in many ways, and perhaps deservedly so, but in other ways that's a very tragic statement. It's symptomatic of the fact that he saw God as someone to grab hold of and to extract from God whatever he wanted. I think it's interesting that God would choose such an unattractive and pretty despicable man as the one through whom he would create the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, you think about the lineage. You've got his grandfather, the grandfather of Jacob being Abraham, a man of great faith who did some pretty amazing things. And then, of course, his son was Isaac. And Isaac was not a bad guy. He was not quite as heroic, I guess, in probably many people's opinion, as his father Abraham. And now you have Jacob. So it's interesting. It begins with a bang, this lineage, in the form of a spectacular promise to Abraham that God gave, that you will bless, essentially that God will use his people to redeem all of creation and to bless all the nations. And that's consummated in Revelation 22. But you can almost hear the New York Philharmonic Orchestra playing when God is delivering this promise to Abraham. And then along comes Isaac, and he's more like the guy that's accompanied by maybe a couple of jazz musicians playing in the back of a bar. And finally, here's Jacob, whose faith might be well represented by maybe a middle schooler doing a clarinet solo. So what started out with such great promise began to change course. And were I Abraham, I think I would have expected a smooth trajectory. I mean, one that was heavenward, with each subsequent generation shining just a little more brightly than the one before it. And instead we see fits and starts, we see peaks, and we see even more valleys. We see spiritual schizophrenia at work in this family, with things being far more messy and confusing than we care to admit, and probably than Abraham may have expected. Like so much of what God does, it's unexpected. And if you're like me, we have this notion that when we become truly spiritual, truly mature, life will become, in many ways, much more serene. Now, we think of it as faith as sort of a mature faith as like a nirvana-like experience, like, say, sitting on a rock and reading, I don't know, Hallmark sayings while gazing at a placid lake on a perfectly beautiful fall day. But following Jesus, I think, is more like a gritty, messy journey that costs us everything, including our expectations. But it's something that we'd not trade for anything. And the older we get, I think the more we can appreciate that, at least in many instances. So God seems to, he seems to place us in these dirty and gritty scenes that we'd rather not partake in so often in our lives. And there, amidst the mess and the ugliness and the confusion, because God loves to contrast ugliness, and He wants to paint beauty in the midst of ugliness through us. And there, perhaps precisely because of His love of contrast, He contrasts even messiness with a beauty and symmetry and order through us. In short, it's sort of like God seems to love to plant a flower in that little crack in the middle of this vast wasteland of an abandoned parking lot that pops up and is all the more beautiful precisely because of the contrast that flower provides to the setting in which it finds itself. God just loves to display His image in scenes that seem conspicuously devoid of it. So speaking of gritty and dirty, let's take an opening glance at the kind of family in which our protagonist, Joseph, comes from. It's like all of our families, just a matter of degree. It's dysfunctional. In Genesis 37, it sort of describes things, a little family background. Jacob had 4 wives, which was common in the ancient Near East. His first wife was Leah. Long story behind all of these, which we can't get into right now. Leah had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. I'm not great at pronunciations. So Leah had the most children of any of his 4 wives. The oldest being Reuben, and then Simeon and Levi and Judah. They were the first 4 children that Jacob had, and that was through Leah. And then there was Jacob's favorite wife, who was Rachel, And she had Joseph, who was the 12th in line, and Benjamin, who was even younger than Joseph, who was 13th. And then there was Zilpah, I'm not sure I got that right, who was Leah's servant, right? His first wife, Leah, she had a servant named Zilpah. And she had two children by Jacob, Gad, who was the 7th in line, 7th oldest, and Asher, the 8th oldest. And finally, there's Bilhah, who was Rachel's servant. Boy, this is getting very complicated, as you can only imagine. Can you imagine what the dinner time conversation must have been like? Wow. So Bilhah had two children, Dan, who was the 5th oldest of Jacob's sons, and Naphtali, son, woman. I don't even know, frankly, which is male, which is female, but it's fascinating. Anyway, that is sort of the family tree, if I could put it that way. So we have a family, or maybe better, it's more of a coalition of families, consisting of 4 wives, and 2 of which were the servants of Jacob's existing 2 wives. It doesn't get much messier than that. So we will now look at Genesis 37, 1 through 11 to get a sense of how some of these siblings and half-siblings got along. So let me go ahead and read Genesis 37, 1 through 11, just to get a lay of the land. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan, and this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Well, youngest brother turning in the older ones. Not good. Now Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Shocking. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had." Can't you just see him? "Hey guys, listen to this dream. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves, older brothers, gathered around mine and bowed down to it." Imagine how well that went over. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers again. Clearly, Joseph is not learning well. He's not picking up on social cues. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." So now the cosmos is bowing down to him. And of course, he wants to publicize that. And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him. Even his father was not happy, and said, "What is this dream you have? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Well, we have quite a happy family here. I would say it's going very well so far, wouldn't you? So, just to throw some gas on this already dysfunctional fire, we have a father in Jacob who breaks almost every marriage and family systems rule possible as he decides to play favorites and therefore fosters jealousy among his children. And as if playing favorites were not bad enough, Jacob adds to that the breaking of a cultural norm in which states that the oldest son should be given more honor and inheritance than those who were younger. It was just a given. The father, Jacob, makes it clear that Joseph, the son of his favorite wife, Rachel, is favored over older brothers, most of which are born from his first wife, Leah. Well, that's a very combustible arrangement, just waiting for a spark. But then again, it might help to remember that Jacob himself deceived his own father, Isaac, to cheat his older brother Esau out of his father's inheritance. So again, Jacob is the maneuverer. He is the one who's calculated. He always has a better plan. He needs control. He wants control. He will seize control at every opportunity. His mother was complicit in many ways. So he may have come by some of that honestly. But you see that virus of control and manipulation taking place even now as he begins to position his own children and even play them against each other, if even unwittingly. But in Jacob's world, everything is alterable. Everything is manipulatable, whatever, if that's a word. He just, in many ways, he wants to be God, right? Just a quick aside about that. One of the things that we're living in right now in the Western world is sort of a battle between what's called realism and nominalism. That's fancy words, fancy philosophical words for realism, which people of faith, both Christian and other religions, tend to be, and that is that there is an order to all things, and that human beings, just to put it real simply, flourish most when they are recognizing and adhering to the order, to living within the grooves of the created design, if I could put it that way. And so to cooperate with God and with the order of things is the best way to ensure human flourishing and happiness. But what is happening now, I think there's been a huge shift in the last it's probably started a long time ago, but kind of the rebellion of the nominalists. The nominalists reject realism. They believe that, in some ways it's, dare I say, sort of the natural, logical trajectory of believing that we're just random accidents in a chance universe. And so they believe there is no real ultimate order to things, that since we are accidents, we can make up our own order, our own story, our own design, and we can do whatever we want. We can become whoever we say we are. Everything is manipulatable. There's that word again, the M word. And so even my identity, even ultimately anything at all must bow down and become subject to my will. And while that's sort of reaching an extreme stage today, and I think ultimately at the core of it goes back to Genesis 3, where I shall be as God, and therefore I'm sovereign over all things. But it also has a religious cloak to it. Many people of faith, myself included, at times have sort of had a theistic nominalism plague their lives, right? Where we just decide what things are. We don't adhere to traditions. Anything outside of my sovereign self or my own personal opinion is considered an act of aggression and oppression. So you kind of see that at work here in Jacob's life. Traditions are made to be manipulated. Everything is alterable. In some ways, he was a theistic nominalist, if I could put it that way. And so we begin. Joseph is the de facto chosen one, and he knows it, as do his brothers, and we are off to a very rocky start in this story. But I want to stop there. I want to respect your time, and I want to leave you with some questions just to ponder. And it may be that I can get these put up somewhere. I'm not quite sure, since I'm such a novice at all this. But I would like to discuss them this Sunday morning, if at all possible, and maybe something you could journal over even. First question is, does wrestling with God seem an apt analogy to describe your relationship with Christ? Wrestling with God. Yeah, that kind of describes who I am. That's kind of what it's felt like. I'm not talking about theologically, but experientially. Is that what it feels like to be a Christian? And if not, what other analogy might you use to describe what it's like in your Christian faith? God is a wrestler. That's certainly the one that God leaves us with Jacob. How about God as a conductor? Maybe that sort of fits you better, and my job is to find my seat and section in the divine orchestra from which I can play my instrument with increasing skill and therefore contribute greatly to the beauty of the melody of praise and worship throughout my life. For me, I find the analogy of God as my script writer, as the director, if I could put it that way. Surrendering the script of my life to God, inviting God to write that script with the objective being to display His image in all of its beauty in every scene to which I'm assigned. So my job is not to control the scenes that I'm in, but to read my lines in every scene that I find myself and turn that scene into, at least however modestly, a sanctuary of worship. So what is the analogy that you might use to describe the experience of being a Christian, maybe to a friend of yours or just to one another? Second question, what family do you come from? How messy was it? Perhaps even severely dysfunctional? Have you ever been tempted to think in one of two things? Either A, that your family of origin is so messed up and dysfunctional that all you can aspire to is spiritual survival. You know, that you're kind of deep down inside, you feel like I'm just predestined to mediocrity at best. And that your family heritage disqualifies you from flourishing into someone who displays the beauty of Christ in a breathtaking way. Is that you? Deep down inside, maybe you've never quite said it or articulated it, but it's lodged in your soul. Well, if so, stay tuned for hope. Or maybe you're tempted to believe that in your own house, truth be told, it's kind of messy. It's more chaotic than serene. You know, and deep down that maybe you know that you and me and that we're all kind of hypocrites. It's a matter of degree. You know, that's just the nature of the messiness of this whole thing. But yet God is at work in spite of and through all of it. But that you're afraid that your kids, because of your house's many glitches and imperfections and foibles, that your kids are destined to reject the faith because of the chaos that is your home. And that if you're feeling that way, a degree of hopelessness, stay tuned for hope. The third of 4 questions here. In what ways do you live like Jacob as a manipulator? We live in suburbia, right? Control is everything. Competition and control. That is, can you think of a way or ways in which you either self-promote, self-protect, or self-provide, manipulating, arranging, or maneuvering your way through life? Is God someone you use as a resource, or is God a shepherd that you entrust yourself to? Depends on the day for me. Why do you do that? Do you feel ashamed while or after you do that? Manipulating your way through the day and looking back and just saying, Lord, I'm so sorry, but I was too afraid to do anything else. What fear is at the root of that need to compete and control? What fear is it that drives that? And finally, do you ever feel deep down that you only rely upon God when all other options are exhausted? Guilty as charged many times. If so, do you find it comforting that God often uses broken paintbrushes like Jacob and like us to draw straight lines or to paint beautiful pictures or masterpieces? And if that's you ever consider this, that the feeling of shame, that is the awareness that we're desperately broken and pretty hypocritical, is a necessary prerequisite, actually, for being used by God? Ever thought of that as a upside down virtue? Put another way, have you ever considered that it's not our sinfulness that keeps us from being used by God so much as our righteousness, or alleged righteousness? Anyway, let's talk about those Sunday morning, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Have a great day.